Hello, and welcome to this very special episode of Lighting with Ethan. I'm your host, Ethan, and today we're going to talk about real-time lights, because that's what Eevee has. If you're familiar with lighting in cycles, you're familiar with ray trace lighting. This lets you bounce rays all over the place and get really dynamic lighting really easily. Eevee doesn't have that because ray trace lighting is slow. Instead, with Eevee, you're going to have to fake it to get the same level of dynamic lighting. What this means is that lights in Eevee might not act the way you expect them to, but the path to wisdom is understanding. So let's jump into it. I'm going to cover how lights work in this episode, and next episode I'm going to chat about using Eevee's larger toolset to spruce up your scene. If we add a light and take a look at the light panel, we can see a couple of interesting things. First off, the spec has been separated from the power, and that works about as you would expect. Second, it's got a radius setting, so that's interesting. We'll come back to these. It's under the shadow panel that things start to get a little crazy. Because Eevee's faking it, it's giving us a host of tools to dial in exactly what we want our shadows to look like. Shadows in Eevee are calculated at a designated resolution. You can set that resolution in the render settings panel. There's two options here, cube size and cascade size. They're both useful. Point lights, spotlights, and area lights all use cube, while sunlights use cascade. Point lights and sunlights are treated a little bit differently because of this, and have some different settings for both those options. In this panel, you'll also see the shadow method setting. On a basic level, both of the options work the same. They have different strengths and weaknesses though, so you should definitely go look this up and find what those are. Going back to the shadow panel, there's two basic things to pay attention to: clipping and bias. Clipping lets us control what shadows we want. For example, adding clear and reflective materials to a flashlight might be too hard. We'd rather just put a glowy material here. Clipping lets us choose not to have objects a certain distance from the light cast shadow, which allows us to just insert this light into the flashlight object and keep the flashlight object from casting nasty shadows where we don't want them. With sunlights, clipping is more important to know about because, unlike cycles, sunlights in Eevee have shadow ranges, and the range starts from the sun object location. Additionally, there's a shadow distance from camera, which is important to understand. This setting will fade out shadows as they get further away from our camera. These controls let you dial in exactly where and how you want the sunlight to shade. Play around with these settings, but in brief, you need to position the sun in a place where it can properly shade your scene. In large scenes like this one, managing the sun lamp position and cascade map distance is going to be important. Not casting shadows on things that don't need shadows means more resolution in the shadows that you do care about. Bias, on the other hand, is a little bit more complicated. Briefly, it's a technique to help game engines get rid of nasty artifacts from shadow resolutions. Turns out, shadow bias is a great solution to this problem, and it's used all over the place. Here's an easy example from Overwatch. You can see the shadow from McCree's hat kind of fading away as it gets closer to his brim. In most situations, bias isn't going to be a major problem. The most noticeable place where they're visible is contact points, and to that end, Eevee has a separate option called contact shadows. Contact shadows are a little bit more expensive, but they're a great solution for this problem. They can be a little inconsistent though, because they're calculated via screen space, so use them only when you need them. If you're in a situation where the bias is just really nasty, there's a couple options to help control it. Exponent and bleed bias are DAC control. Exponent for ESM shadows and bleed bias for VSM. They adjust the distance the bias fades across. Use at your own discretion, obviously, because a high exponent can start to make your shadows look a little bit weird. Another cool shadow thing you can use is soft shadows. Remember the light radius from earlier? Soft shadows work by sampling that light radius and then layering the result into the viewport. Something that's really interesting is you can see it calculate while you move in the viewport. Soft shadows are pretty awesome, but be careful when you're using them because your scene will get very heavy very quickly. For the studio setup I made here, using soft lights was very important to the look and feel of making that very soft studio setup. Obviously, this comes across better in the render than in the viewport though. Here's some things that I've learned about using lights in Eevee. Don't use shadows if you don't need to. On a fill light, sometimes the shadows are just going to make it worse. Just disable the shadow and enjoy the nice glow. This goes hand in hand with using the custom radius for lights. On a complicated mesh, such as a tree, you can use a shadeless light to fake translucency in the leaves. In this case, though, you would want to use the custom radius option to make sure that the light doesn't affect other parts of the scene. We noticed earlier that lights have a separate control for the specular and the power. This is one of those fun things that isn't realistic at all, but it gives us power as designers to do cool things. I've been experimenting with this to put a fake specular highlight in characters' eyes, when I don't necessarily want additional light influencing the character's face. Here's a fun one. With all the coolness that collections bring, instance lights don't have shadows. Instead, you'll have to make it real or just plan for it and set up your lights differently. I learned this while trying to make a studio light collection that I could just duplicate around. Very frustrating. And that's the story. I'm using a bunch of these techniques for my scenes. In the claw machine example, the overhead lights don't need shadow because I'm just using it to light the scene and make sure that the site is well lit. I've placed area lights for the studio lamps that I want emitting light. These lights are large and soft. When soft shadows are turned on, they provide an excellent effect. There's also some additional miscellaneous lights as well. A couple interior area lights, as well as a light for the machine banner. The machine banner light doesn't need shadows either, so I've turned it off. Eevee's greatest strength is its speed, so I try to keep it as optimized as possible. If something doesn't need shadows, turn them off. Don't worry if your lighting is feeling a little flat. Eevee's got tools to deal with that. We're going to chat about those next episode though, so stay tuned if that's what you're into.